They said she would destroy him. A spoiled Boston socialite shipped west like unwanted cargo, forced into marriage with a man she'd never met, to settle a debt she never made. Carson Hale had survived blizzards, drought, cattle thieves, and bank failures. He had buried partners and outlasted enemies, but nothing, not one single thing in 15 brutal years on the Montana frontier, had prepared him for the woman who stepped off that train. Because Eleanor Whitmore didn't come to Montana to survive. She came to win, and she almost took everything with her. Fatsi. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't regret it. The morning the train was supposed to arrive, Carson Hale didn't go to the station. He sent his foreman instead. Hank Briggs had worked Iron Ridge Ranch for 11 years, long enough to know when his employer was avoiding something, and smart enough not to say so out loud. He hitched the buckboard, pulled his hat down against the October wind cutting off the Rockies, and rode the 6 miles into Millhaven without a word of complaint. Carson stayed behind and checked fence lines that didn't need checking. He walked the north pasture for the second time that week, counting cattle. He'd already counted, measuring with his eyes the winter grass that still had 3 good weeks of growth left in it. He did everything a man does when he's trying to convince himself he's too busy to think about something that's already eating him alive. The marriage contract had arrived in August, tucked inside a letter from his late father's attorney in Helena, written in the careful, emotionless language that lawyers use when they're delivering news they don't want to be blamed for. The Whitmore family of Boston had held a promissory note against the original Iron Ridge land deed, a debt Carson's father had signed in 1861 and never mentioned to his son. 22 years of compounding interest and legal maneuvering had produced a document that gave the Whitmores a legitimate claim to the eastern third of Iron Ridge Ranch, unless the terms were satisfied. The terms were simple and monstrous. Marriage between Carson Elias Hale and Miss Eleanor Ann Whitmore, only daughter of Reginald Whitmore, to be completed within 90 days of notification. Full settlement of the land claim upon the union being legally recognized. Carson had read the letter 3 times. Then he'd walked out to the barn and stood in the dark for a long while, not doing anything, just standing. He was 45 years old. He'd spent those years building something. Iron Ridge wasn't just land and cattle. It was the reason he'd eaten cold beans through 17 consecutive winters. The reason he'd worked until his hands bled and his back had permanently stopped cooperating on cold mornings. It was his father's dream, badly started, that Carson had taken over at 28 with nothing but 40 head of half-starved cattle and a deed that was more debt than asset. He wasn't going to lose the eastern third. That land held the best water access on the property. Without it, the ranch would die slowly. And Carson wasn't the kind of man who watched things die slowly, so he'd written back. He accepted. The wedding had taken place by proxy, through attorneys, which struck Carson as both efficient and deeply strange. He was legally married to a woman he had never seen. She was traveling west on a train he refused to meet, and somewhere in Boston, a family he'd never spoken to was celebrating a transaction they disguised as matrimony. He found himself wondering, standing in that cold north pasture, whether Eleanor Whitmore had any more choice in this than he did. The thought was uncomfortable. He pushed it aside and went to count the cattle again. Well, Hank Briggs returned around noon, and he wasn't alone. Carson heard the buckboard before he saw it. The particular sound of iron wheels on gravel that had been the background rhythm of his life for 15 years. He was in the yard when it rolled through the gate, and he made himself stop walking and stand still, which cost him more effort than he expected. What he saw first was the bag. One bag. A single dark brown leather traveling case, worn at the corners, sitting in the bed of the buckboard like an afterthought. He'd been told Eleanor Whitmore came from money. He'd assumed there would be trunks, hat boxes, the elaborate and space-consuming luggage of a woman raised in comfort. One bag was not what he expected. What he saw second was the woman herself. She was sitting in the buckboard's front bench beside Hank, and she was not doing what Carson had imagined she would be doing. He'd pictured her pressed back against the seat with her handkerchief up, appalled by the dust and the smell and the endless open landscape that unnerved most people who came from cities. He'd pictured fragility. Eleanor Whitmore was looking at his fences. She wasn't even looking at him yet. She was studying the fence line along the east boundary of the yard with an expression of focused, particular interest. The kind of look a man gives a piece of equipment when he's trying to figure out what's wrong with it. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-20s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back practically. A gray traveling coat that had clearly been made for eastern winters, not Montana ones. Her face was... He searched for the word and came up short. Not beautiful exactly, not in the way that word usually got used. She had a quality of alertness that made her interesting to look at, like something was always running behind her eyes. She turned and looked at him. He had the disorienting sensation of being assessed. Not admired, not feared, not dismissed. Assessed. The way you look at a property before you decide whether it's worth buying. "Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was clear and carried well in the open air. "Miss Whitmore," he said, then caught himself. "Mrs. Hale." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. "That's going to take some getting used to, for both of us." She climbed down from the buckboard before Hank could offer to help her, which made the old foreman blink. Carson noticed she moved carefully, but without hesitation. The way someone moves in unfamiliar territory when they're paying attention. Her boots hit the ground of Iron Ridge Ranch, and she stood for a moment looking at it. Carson watched her take in the yard, the barn, the main house with its wide porch, and its 20 years of practical modifications that had accumulated without any particular plan. Her expression didn't change much. He couldn't tell if she was satisfied or disappointed or something else entirely. "Your east fence," she said, turning back to him. He blinked. "What about it?" "The fourth post from the gate is sinking. The ground drainage there is pulling water underneath it. You can see where the soil has shifted." She looked at him directly. "If you leave it, you'll have a gap before spring." Carson looked at the fence post. He looked back at her. "I noticed it on the way in," she said, without any particular emphasis on the words, like she was simply delivering information and didn't much care how he received it. Hank Briggs, beside her, had the expression of a man watching something he wasn't sure he'd be able to accurately describe later. "I'll have someone look at it," Carson said. "Good." She turned toward the house. "Could someone show me where I'll be staying? I'd like to wash the train off me, and then I'd like to see the account books." There was a pause. Carson was pretty sure he'd never heard anyone, in 15 years on this ranch, respond to arriving at a new home by asking to see account books. "The account books," he said. "Yes." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "I assume you keep them. Given what I know about the state of this property's finances, which is admittedly not much, which is the problem, I'd like to start understanding what I've married into." "What you've married into," Carson said, and he was aware that his voice had an edge to it that he hadn't planned. Eleanor stopped walking. She turned around to face him fully, and there was something in the way she did it, unhurried, deliberate, that made him feel absurdly like the one who'd said something wrong. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I am aware this was not your choice. I am also aware it was not mine. I have traveled 2,000 miles to a place I have never seen, to live with a man I have never met, in a territory where I know precisely no one. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for the same honesty you would give a business partner, because that is, in the most accurate sense, what we are." She held his gaze. "I will work," she said. "I will not be a burden to you or this ranch, but I need information to do that. So yes, account books. After I wash the train off me." Another pause. Carson became aware that Hank was looking at the middle distance with intense concentration, the way a man does when he's trying very hard not to have a visible reaction. "Hank," Carson said. "Yeah, boss." "Show her to the east room." "Yes, sir." "And have someone look at that fence post." "Yes, sir." He set the account books out on the dining room table before supper. He wasn't sure why. He'd spent the hours in between walking the property and trying to talk himself into the version of the situation where it was manageable, where she stayed out of the way, learned the rhythms of the place quietly, and they found some polite coexistence that didn't require much from either of them. That was what he'd been imagining for the 3 months since the lawyer's letter arrived. But the image of her standing in the yard calling out his fence post before she'd taken 10 steps on his property had done something stubborn to that plan. He put out the last 5 years of ledgers and 2 years of supply contracts and the correspondence with the Helena Bank, and went to eat supper feeling like a man who had just done something he couldn't take back, but wasn't sure yet whether that was good or bad. She came to the table in fresh clothes, simpler than the traveling coat, a dark blue dress that was clearly practical rather than decorative, and she ate without complaint. The cook, a taciturn woman named May, who had worked the ranch kitchen for 9 years, had made stew and cornbread, which was what she made when she was making a point about something. Carson had never quite figured out what point. Eleanor ate it without visible reaction, which either meant she didn't care or she was choosing her battles. He decided it was the second one. They talked over supper because silence would have been worse. He told her about the ranch, the 1,000 head of cattle, the relationship with the buyers in Great Falls, the ongoing negotiation with the Dawson family over shared water rights on the creek running the southern boundary, the hand he'd recently let go because of the stealing and the gap that had left in the crew. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She asked, occasionally, a question that was precise in a way that caught him slightly off guard each time. Not broad questions, not the kind of polite questions someone asked to seem interested, but specific questions that showed she'd been tracking details. How long has the water rights dispute with the Dawsons been going on? 3 years, going on 4. And in that time, have the terms changed? They've moved some. In whose favor? Theirs, mostly. He said it reluctantly. They've got a lawyer in Helena who keeps finding new angles. What lawyer? Fellow named Pratt, Thomas Pratt. She nodded and didn't say anything else about it, and he made a note of that. She'd stored the information and moved on. She wasn't performing interest, she was collecting. After supper, she went straight to the account books. Carson went to his office, which was adjacent to the dining room, and tried to concentrate on a letter he owed the bank. He heard, from the next room, the quiet sound of pages turning. Not frantically, not quickly, methodically, with occasional pauses. Around 9 o'clock, he gave up on the letter and went to stand in the doorway. She had her sleeves rolled up. There was a coffee cup beside the first ledger that May must have brought her without being asked, which meant May had already made some kind of decision about Eleanor Whitmore that he hadn't been consulted on. 3 of the ledgers were open simultaneously, and she was moving between them in a pattern he couldn't immediately identify. She looked up when she heard him. "Your hay supplier," she said. "Barker. Tom Barker, out of Billings. You've been paying him 11 cents per ton above the standard rate for the last 3 years. Did you know that?" Carson came into the room. "I've known Tom Barker for 12 years. That's not what I asked. He looked at the ledger she was pointing at. The numbers were clear enough. He'd known, in a vague way, that the rate had crept up. He told himself there were good reasons: relationship, reliability, distance. He hadn't done what she'd apparently just done in 2 hours, which was compare it systematically against the rate listed in 2 other supply contracts from the same period. "It's not just Barker," she said, and her voice wasn't accusatory. That was what made it harder to deflect. She sounded like she was describing weather. "Your harness supplier is similarly priced, and the veterinary visits are being billed at a flat fee that seems to have been set a long time ago and never renegotiated. Doc Heelan has been with this ranch since my father's time. I understand. I'm not suggesting you stop using him." She looked up at him again. "I'm suggesting that loyalty and fair negotiation are not mutually exclusive, that you can value a relationship and still know what things cost." Carson sat down across the table from her. He did it slowly because his back was giving him trouble and also because he needed a moment. "How much?" he said. "Total overpayment across identifiable line items over the last 3 years?" She turned back one ledger page, ran her finger down a column, and reached for a pencil. He watched her do arithmetic in the margin in a quick, economical hand. Somewhere between $900 and $1,200. Give or take, depending on what you were actually getting for the price in some cases. There are a few I need more information to evaluate. $900 to $1,200. In 3 years. On a ranch where last year's net profit, after costs and debt service, had been a little over $4,000. He was quiet for a moment. "You do this often?" he said. "Do what?" "Sit down with someone's accounts for 2 hours and find the problems." She considered the question, and he got the impression she was deciding how honest to be. "My father owns 3 textile factories," she said. "He raised me to understand how a business works. Not because he thought I'd run one, he doesn't think I should, But he talked about it constantly, and I listened, and I have a mind that remembers numbers. A slight pause. He would not be pleased to know how useful that has turned out to be. There was something in the last sentence that he didn't press on. A door, slightly open, that he sensed should stay that way for now. "I'll set up meetings," he said, "with Barker and Heelan, and the harness supplier, and him." She nodded and looked back at the books. He sat there for a moment longer than he'd planned, watching her work, and had the unsettling thought that whoever had arranged this marriage as a punishment, for him, presumably, or for her, or maybe for both of them, might have made a significant miscalculation. The ranch hands knew by morning. This was inevitable on a working ranch with a bunkhouse full of men who had nothing to do in the evenings but talk. By the time Carson walked out to the barn at first light, he could feel it. That particular current in the air of a group of people who have collectively decided they have opinions about something. He didn't address it. He gave out the day's assignments and went about his work and waited. It didn't take long. Pete Garza was the one who said it, which surprised Carson, because Pete had always been decent, a competent hand, good with the horses, not generally one to create problems. But he said it loud enough to be heard by the three men working nearby, which meant it was meant to be heard. What's she going to do when it actually snows? Send her maid back east for warmer stockings? The men nearby found this funny. Carson turned and looked at Pete for a long moment. "You have something you want to say to me, Pete?" "No, sir." But the grin didn't entirely go away. "Then get those horses to the north pasture." The grin faded. Pete went. But Carson knew it wouldn't end there, and it didn't. The kitchen was the center of the operation, not the barn. May ran it with quiet efficiency and had opinions about everything that happened at Iron Ridge Ranch, delivered never in words, always in the temperature of the stove and the quality of the coffee. When Carson came in for his mid-morning break and found the coffee unusually good, he understood that May had also made a decision about Pete Garza, and it was not a favorable one. What he didn't expect was to find Eleanor already at the kitchen table. She was talking to May. Actually talking, not performing conversation. She was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, with the posture of someone who is genuinely paying attention. May, who had not said more than 14 consecutive words to any human being in Carson's memory, was describing the supply ordering process for the kitchen with what, for May, constituted animation. Carson stood in the doorway and listened. "So you write the order on the 1st of each month," Eleanor was saying. "Second," May said. "First is always something. Second is reliable. And the delivery from Millhaven comes when? Whenever Jake Purvis feels like driving out, which is usually a week after I want it." The faintest trace of a feeling in May's voice, not quite irritation, something practiced and long resigned. "What if you ordered 3 days earlier to account for that?" May looked at her. "You think I haven't thought of that?" "I think the kitchen ordering calendar you showed me has the order date and the delivery date the same, which suggests either the system was set up by someone who thought Jake Purvis was more reliable than he is, or it hasn't been updated in a while." A long pause. May poured Carson's coffee without being asked, which was either a sign that she'd known he was there the whole time, or that the action was so automatic it had no connection to awareness. "Been the same since Mr. Hale's father ran the place," May said. "Then maybe it's time to adjust it." May looked at Carson. He looked back. May's expression communicated several things without using words. "Morning," Carson said, and sat down. Eleanor looked at him without surprise, which meant she had also known he was there. "Good morning." May was explaining the supply system. "I heard. There are 3 places where the timing creates problems. It's not just the delivery lag. The storage quantities are also conservative in a way that creates unnecessary shortages during peak work periods, like branding week." May made a sound. It was not quite a word. It conveyed with remarkable efficiency that the issue of branding week supplies had been a source of private suffering for some time. "I'll talk to Purvis," Carson said. "You've talked to Purvis?" May said. "I'll talk to him differently." "Or," Eleanor said, "we could look at whether there's a second supplier in Millhaven who might be interested in the contract and let Mr. Purvis know there's competition. People often find reliability when there's an incentive to." Another pause. Carson drank his coffee. It was very good. "She's right," May said, which may have been the most surprising 4 consecutive syllables Carson had heard in his adult life. The first week was a war of small things. Not with Eleanor, with everyone else. She walked through the operations with the focused attention of someone taking inventory, and she asked questions, constantly, patiently, precisely. And the ranch hands didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't loud, she wasn't demanding, she didn't come out to the barn and give orders which they'd been braced for. She watched, and she listened, and she wrote things in a small notebook that she carried in her coat pocket. And she did it all with such quiet consistency that by the end of the week it had stopped feeling unusual and started feeling inevitable. Pete Garza remained hostile. He didn't do anything that crossed a line. Carson ran too tight an operation for outright insubordination. But there was a coldness there, a deliberate absence of the ordinary courtesies that working men extend to the people they share space with. He didn't acknowledge Eleanor when she came to the barn. He talked over her observations when she made them. He laughed, not quite under his breath, at a joke another hand made at her expense. Carson watched this and said nothing yet, which was its own kind of statement. What he watched instead was Eleanor's response, which was to not respond. Not in anger, not in retreat. She made a note in her book and moved on. On the 5th day, she asked Hank Briggs to show her the breeding records. Hank had the records going back 9 years, kept in a system he'd invented himself that made complete sense to Hank and was essentially decipherable by no other living person. He had been, Carson knew, privately waiting for Eleanor to ask about them so he could explain that the system was complex and perhaps she might prefer to focus on other areas. What he was not expecting was for her to sit down with the records for 2 hours and then emerge with a specific, documented observation about a pattern in the calving rates that Hank himself had never identified. Your bull rotation, she said. Every 3rd season you have lower conception rates in the Northwest pasture herd. Hank looked at the record she was pointing at. He opened his mouth and closed it. I assumed it was the grass quality out there, Carson said. Maybe, Eleanor said, but the pasture isn't consistent with the timing. You've had good grass years and bad grass years in that cycle, and the rate stays low regardless. It's every 3rd season. That's not random. She looked at Hank. Which bull is in rotation for the Northwest herd in the low years? Hank looked at his records with the expression of a man who had just found something behind a piece of furniture he'd owned for years and never thought to look under. Number 4, he said slowly. Old Henry. And Old Henry is 12 years old, Hank said. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Well, Hank said. I could be wrong, Eleanor said. There might be other factors, but it seems worth checking. Yeah, Hank said. He was looking at the records differently now. Yeah, it does. He caught Carson's eye. Carson kept his face neutral. But later, when Eleanor had gone back to the house, Hank found him by the water trough and said, without preamble, "She's not what I expected." No, Carson agreed. You going to tell me what you expected? Carson thought about that fence post she'd spotted from the moving buckboard. I don't think I'm going to win that answer. Hank made a sound that might have been a laugh, which was rare enough to be notable. The renegotiation with Tom Barker happened on a Tuesday at the general store in Millhaven, and Eleanor was there. This had not been Carson's original plan. He'd intended to handle it himself, man to man, the way business had always been handled. He'd told Eleanor as much the night before, as diplomatically as he could manage. She'd looked at him in that way she had of looking at him that made him feel like his reasoning was being quietly examined. Why? She'd asked. Because Barker and I have a history. He'd feel it might go better if I'm not there. If it stays the way it's always been. The way it's always been, she said, has cost you $1,200 over 3 years. She said it without heat, which was almost more difficult to deal with than if she'd been angry about it. I'm not asking to run the meeting. I'm asking to be there. Those are different things. He thought about arguing. He concluded, not for the first time that week, that his arguments in this area were not strong. She came to the meeting. Tom Barker was a heavy-set man in his 50s who wore his suspenders pulled too tight and had the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time looking into sun. He'd been supplying Iron Ridge hay for 12 years. He'd attended Carson Hale's father's funeral. He came into the store's back room where they'd arranged to talk, clapped Carson on the arm, and then registered Eleanor with the briefest flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. "This your new bride?" Barker said. This is Eleanor, Carson said. She's helping me look at the ranch's operational costs. Barker's gaze moved to Eleanor with a particular quality that Carson recognized as the look men gave women who were occupying a space those men considered to be not for women. Polite on the surface, faintly skeptical below it. Eleanor smiled at Tom Barker. It was a perfectly good smile. It communicated nothing in particular. Tom, Carson said, I want to talk about the rate. The conversation was not comfortable. Carson had known it wouldn't be. Barker pushed back on the rate change with the confidence of a man who assumed his long relationship with the ranch gave him standing that would override the numbers. And he was right that it gave him standing, but he'd miscalculated how much. He made his arguments. They were the usual ones: reliability, distance, the difficulty of the supply in hard winters, the relationship with the elder Hale that he seemed to think should function as a permanent credit. Carson listened and then said, The numbers show we've been paying above rate for 3 years, Tom. I need that corrected going forward. Barker sighed the sigh of a man performing wounded dignity. Carson, I've been loyal to this ranch, and I appreciate that. I want to keep working with you. Carson looked at him steadily. But I need the rate corrected. A pause. Barker shifted in his chair. His eyes moved to Eleanor briefly, and then away. She had said nothing, had done nothing, was simply sitting there with her hands folded on the table in the mild expression of someone who is present, but not demanding to be. Somehow, her presence was louder than if she'd spoken. How much of a correction we talking? Barker said. Standard rate for the territory, Carson said. 9 cents per ton. Another pause. The arithmetic was clearly running in Barker's head. I could do 10. 9, Carson said. Barker looked at Eleanor again. Eleanor looked back pleasantly. 9, Barker said, with the tone of a man conceding something he hadn't expected to concede. On the drive back to the ranch, Eleanor said nothing for the first mile. Then, You didn't need me there for that. No, Carson said. Then why did you let me come? He thought about the honest answer, which was that he'd realized arguing against it was pointless and had decided to find out whether she'd been right. That seemed like too much honesty for a Tuesday afternoon. You found the problem, he said. Seemed fair you should see it fixed. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. That's a reasonable answer, she said finally. Thank you. It's not the real one, but it's reasonable. He said nothing. The horse's hooves on the frozen ground made a sound like something being counted. The letter from Reginald Whitmore arrived in the 3rd week of October. Carson knew who it was from before he opened it. The Whitmore family's attorneys used thick cream-colored envelopes that felt expensive even before you touched the paper inside. He opened it at the kitchen table in the early morning, while the ranch was still quiet and Eleanor was still asleep. It was not from the attorneys, it was from Reginald Whitmore himself. The handwriting was forceful and somewhat irregular, the writing of a man accustomed to having other people convert his words into formal documents, and who wrote personal letters rarely enough that he hadn't developed the smooth consistency of a practiced correspondent. The letter ran to 2 pages. The first page was pleasantries, formal inquiry about the journey, hope that the territory was agreeable, the kind of careful surface-level language that said nothing while occupying space. The second page was the real letter. I want you to understand the terms of our arrangement clearly, Mr. Hale. My daughter is a valuable woman who has received an exceptional education and possesses qualities that would have made her an asset to any number of significant families in this city. The arrangement that has been made is satisfactory to us from a legal standpoint. However, I expect you to treat Eleanor with the dignity appropriate to her station. She is not a frontier woman. She was not raised for the kind of life you lead. I trust you will not expect things from her that she is constitutionally incapable of providing. Carson read that paragraph twice. She is not a frontier woman. The absolute confidence in those 5 words. The certainty that this man knew from 2,000 miles away what his daughter was and was not capable of. He thought of Eleanor at the dining room table, moving between 3 ledgers simultaneously. He thought of her in the barn with Hank, pointing at 12-year-old Old Henry's rotation record. He thought of her at the meeting with Tom Barker, saying nothing, and somehow being louder than anyone else in the room. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about it. He didn't know if Eleanor had received a similar letter or what her father had said to her when she left Boston, or how she felt about any of it. But he knew that Reginald Whitmore had made a mistake in his assessment of his daughter that was going to cost the man something, eventually. Carson wasn't sure what or when. He just knew it with the certainty of someone who had spent 15 years learning to read the signs of things that were about to change. The first real test came in the last week of October, 3 days before the season's first proper frost. It was a Thursday, and it started as a routine day. Carson was out at the eastern pasture with 2 hands, checking the fence line. The post Eleanor had noticed from the buckboard had been fixed, but the ground shift had affected 2 adjacent posts that they'd initially missed. He was deep in the work, pleasantly occupied with the particular problem-solving satisfaction of physical repairs, when he heard the horse coming at a speed that meant something was wrong. It was Billy Crane, 17 years old and the newest hand, riding with the desperate urgency of someone delivering news he didn't know how to carry. "Boss," he said, sliding off his horse before it had fully stopped, "it's the South herd. They've gotten through the fence at the creek boundary. The Dawson wire." Carson felt the cold move through him that wasn't the weather. The Dawson water dispute had been running for 4 years. If his cattle were on Dawson land on the wrong side of that wire, how many head? Maybe 60, maybe more. It's hard to say. They spread out along the creek. Carson was already moving to his horse. "Where's Hank?" "That's the thing, boss. Hank rode out to the north side an hour ago. There was trouble with the gate up there, too. I couldn't reach him." So he had no foreman, 60 head of cattle on disputed land, and the Dawsons, whose lawyer and Helena had been looking for exactly this kind of incident for 4 years, were probably already aware. He looked at Billy. "Ride back to the ranch. Get Pete and whoever else is there and bring them south." "Yes, sir." Billy rode hard back toward the ranch. Carson turned south. He'd been riding for about 20 minutes, fast, the kind of riding that his back was going to complain about tomorrow, when he crested a small rise and pulled up short. Eleanor was already there. She was at the creek boundary, on horseback, and she was not simply standing there. She had apparently found the break in the fence, had somehow located 2 of the ranch horses and a coil of wire from somewhere, and she and one other person, he couldn't see who from this distance, were actively working the fence. Carson rode down. The other person was May. This was so unexpected that Carson stopped his horse and simply stared for a moment. May, who ran the kitchen and had never, to his knowledge, been outside it during working hours, was holding 2 fence posts in place while Eleanor wound wire between them with concentrated workmanlike effort. The cattle were scattered along the creek, some on the Dawson side and some back on the Iron Ridge side. They hadn't gone far. "I counted 58 head, Eleanor said, without looking up from the wire. 4 are still on the wrong side of the creek, but they're moving back on their own. The water's cleaner on our side right now." She tightened a wire twist and moved to the next post. "I sent Billy to find you before I came out. I hope that's—" "He found me." Carson dismounted. "Where did you get the wire?" May knew where the repair supplies were kept. A pause. "May also turns out to ride. I grew up on a farm in Kansas," May said, in a tone that suggested this piece of information had simply never come up before. Carson stood for a moment, looking at the fence, the cattle, the creek, and the 2 women repairing a boundary line that 4 years of legal disputes had made into a powder keg. He felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since August. He went to work on the fence. They worked together for an hour, the 3 of them, and Billy, when he arrived, Pete Garza, notably, appeared 15 minutes later, moving more slowly than the situation warranted. By the time the fence was properly secured and the cattle counted and confirmed to be all back on the correct side of the line, the light had changed to the particular low gold of late afternoon. Carson rode back to the ranch beside Eleanor. "You know the Dawsons might already know," he said. "Their foreman rides the creek line in the mornings," she said. "It's afternoon. We probably have until tomorrow." She glanced at him. "Do you have any record of this fence line failing before?" "No." "You need one. If this goes anywhere legally, you need to be able to show this was a failure of the structure, not a pattern of negligence." She was looking ahead at the ranch. "I'll write up a description of what we found and how we repaired it. Dates, condition of the posts, description of the wire failure. If Hank can confirm it, so much the better." Carson looked at her profile. "You thought of all that," he said. "I thought of it in the last 20 minutes, she said. I had some time while I was winding wire. The horses walked. The cold deepened. Somewhere behind them, the creek sound faded into the broader quiet of the Montana evening. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd been going to say. He found he didn't quite have the words for it. For the accumulation of the past 3 weeks, for the fence post and the account books and the breeding records and Tom Barker's face when he said 9 cents and meant it, and for the sight of her at the creek boundary, winding wire in the wrong coat for a Montana winter, with the focused competence of someone who had decided that this was her problem too, and that problems were things you fixed. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't sufficient. He knew that. But she looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, with that quality she had of seeing past the surface of things, and nodded. "This is my ranch too," she said, "for better or worse." And then she rode ahead and left him with that, and with the particular knowledge that the letter in his pocket from Reginald Whitmore, "She is not a frontier woman," was already, 3 weeks in, so comprehensively wrong that it had become a kind of monument to the danger of deciding what people are before you've given them the chance to show you. The frost came hard that night. In the morning, the ground was white. Eleanor was up before him, which he was beginning to understand was simply the way things were. She was at the kitchen table with a new ledger, one she'd bought in Millhaven and set up herself, with columns for operational observations, when he came in for coffee. "I need to ride out to the south pasture today," she said. "I'll send Hank with you." "I can go alone." "I know you can." He sat down. "I'm sending Hank because 2 people see more than one." She looked at him, and he could see her deciding whether this was reasonable or whether it was something else. She must have decided it was reasonable because she nodded and went back to her ledger. Outside, the wind had shifted north, which meant real winter was somewhere on its way. The ranch was already changing its rhythms in the particular way it did before the hard cold came, the slight increase in speed and intention that the hands got when they could feel the season turning. Carson sat with his coffee and watched Eleanor work and tried to understand what it was he was watching, what it was that the past 3 weeks had actually been, and what the next 3 weeks were going to look like, and the 3 after that, and all the weeks that came after those. He didn't have answers yet. But for the first time since the lawyer's letter arrived in August, the questions didn't feel like a weight pressing down on him. They felt instead like something worth finding out. The frost on the window caught the morning light and held it briefly, bright and sharp and temporary, before the sun moved on and the window became just a window again. Carson finished his coffee and went to work. The frost didn't leave for 4 days. It settled over Iron Ridge like something that intended to stay, turning the yard to iron and putting a particular kind of pressure on the mornings. That cold that gets into the bones of a working ranch and makes everything take longer and cost more effort. Carson had seen 40 Montana winters between his childhood and his own years running the place, and he'd stopped being surprised by them. But he watched Eleanor those 4 days the way you watch someone new at altitude, waiting to see if the elevation is going to catch up with them. It didn't catch up with her. She came out of the house each morning in the same gray wool coat that was definitively not made for Montana, moving quickly and without complaint, and she adapted her rhythm to the cold with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has decided that conditions are conditions and complaining about them doesn't change them. By the second morning, May had produced a heavier coat from somewhere. Carson suspected it had belonged to his late mother, and he said nothing about it. And Eleanor had put it on without ceremony and kept working. She was always working. That was the thing Carson found most disorienting, more than the account books or the fence line or the meeting with Barker. He'd expected on some level that she would find her pace and then slow down, that the first burst of energy was performance, impression-making, the effort someone puts in when they're new and want to establish themselves. He'd seen it before with Green Hands. The first 2 weeks were always their best. Then the reality of the work set in. Eleanor didn't slow down in the 3rd week, or the 4th. She moved, instead, into a kind of focused steadiness that was harder to look away from than the initial burst had been. She'd started riding the property every morning at first light, not with Carson, not with Hank, just alone and quiet, covering different sections of the ranch in a rotation she'd apparently planned out herself. He'd asked her about it once. "I need to understand what I'm working with," she'd said. "You can't fix problems you can't see." "Most of the problems are in the books." "Some of them are," she'd said. "Some of them are in the ground." He hadn't entirely understood that at the time. He understood it better in November, when she came back from a morning ride with mud on her boots and a specific observation about the drainage pattern in the southeast corner of the low pasture that turned out, when they dug into it, to explain a water quality issue that had been quietly reducing that herd's condition for 2 years without anyone identifying the source. It wasn't one dramatic discovery. It was 100 small ones, and each one landed differently than the last, because each one showed a different facet of how her mind worked. Not just numbers, not just patterns, but the way she connected one kind of observation to another across categories that most people kept separate. Hank had stopped being surprised. That itself was notable. Hank Briggs had been surprised by approximately 4 things in the 11 years Carson had known him, and 3 of those were weather events. Now he would come to Carson with a look that meant he had something to report about Eleanor, and he'd deliver it in the flat tone of a man who has revised his expectations and is trying to be professional about the revision. "She asked me about the winter feed strategy today," Hank said one afternoon, leaning against the barn door. "What about it?" "She wanted to know why we feed the east herd first." "Because they're the furthest from the storage." "That's what I told her." And she said that made sense from a distance standpoint, but that the east herd is also the oldest herd, and the oldest cattle need the most feed, and by the time we get to them, they're getting what's left after the other herds, which isn't always what they need. Hank paused. "She asked if we'd looked at the weight averages on the older cattle compared to the younger ones over the last 3 winters." Carson said nothing. "We haven't," Hank said, "but I pulled the records." Another pause, longer. "She's right." What Hank didn't say, and didn't need to, was that the feeding order had been set by Carson's father, and Carson had never questioned it because it had always seemed logical, and because there were only so many things a man could examine at once, and some things just became the way things are through the simple accumulation of time. Carson pulled the feeding order that week. The east herd moved to second. Pete Garza said, loud enough to be heard, that nobody asked him what he thought. Nobody had asked him what he thought. But Pete Garza's opinion had a way of traveling through the bunkhouse and reshaping the atmosphere even when it wasn't addressed directly. And Carson knew he was going to have to deal with it. He just hadn't decided how yet. The deciding got made for him on a Thursday morning when Eleanor came out to the barn at a time she didn't usually come out to it, and found Pete and 2 other hands, a man named Dix Wheeler and the young one, Billy Crane. In a moment they hadn't anticipated being witnessed. Carson wasn't there. He heard about it from Billy that afternoon, delivered in the halting, uncomfortable manner of someone who isn't sure if they're doing the right thing by telling it. Pete had been doing an imitation. That was Billy's careful word for it. He'd had his coat pulled up around his shoulders, mincing slightly, speaking in a high, affected Boston accent that bore no relationship to how Eleanor actually sounded, saying the kinds of things that men say in bunkhouses when they're trying to make each other laugh at someone's expense. Dix Wheeler had been laughing. Billy had not, which was probably why he was the one telling it. "What was she doing?" Carson asked. "Standing in the doorway," Billy said. "She must have been there for, I don't know how long, maybe a while." "What did she say?" Billy was quiet for a moment. "She said, 'When you're finished, Pete, I need someone to help me check the water troughs in the west paddock. There are 3 of them frozen over, and it needs 2 people.' Then she just waited." Carson looked at him. "Pete went," Billy said. "He didn't say anything, he just went." Carson thought about that. Then he went and found Pete at the end of the day and stood with him at the fence by the south barn, and did not deliver the kind of direct confrontation that Pete had probably been waiting for and bracing himself against. Instead, he said, "You still doing that voice in the bunkhouse?" Pete set his jaw. "No, sir." "Good." Carson looked out at the fence line. "Because if I hear you are, you're going to be looking for another situation." It wasn't eloquent, but Pete Garza was still at Iron Ridge Ranch 2 weeks later, which meant something about it had been sufficient. What Carson didn't know until May told him in the oblique way May communicated sensitive information by mentioning it while doing something else and not looking directly at him, was that Eleanor had spoken to Pete herself after the water trough episode. Not in front of anyone. Not in a way that would humiliate him or establish dominance. Just the 2 of them, apparently somewhere near the south barn in the early evening, and nobody knew what was said. But Pete came in for supper that night and sat quietly, And the following morning he was first to respond when Eleanor asked for a volunteer to ride the perimeter fence, and he did it without visible resentment. People around Iron Ridge started calling it, privately, the moment Pete Garza got sorted out. Carson heard it secondhand and said nothing about it. November moved into December with the deliberate, unforgiving progression of a Montana winter building toward its full power. The snow came seriously in the second week of December. Not a dusting, not a warning, but the real thing, the kind that changed the landscape and the workload simultaneously and left no room for inefficiency in anything. Eleanor had been ready for it. This was the thing that Carson kept turning over in his mind during those early winter weeks. She'd been preparing for it for 2 months, quietly, without announcement, in ways that only became fully visible once the snow arrived and the preparations started mattering. She'd reorganized the hay storage so that the highest quality feed was in the most accessible location. She'd renegotiated the delivery schedule with 2 suppliers so that the pre-winter stock arrived in staggered batches, instead of one large load that was hard to manage. She'd worked out a rotation system with May for the kitchen stores that meant they had genuine capacity instead of the chronic small shortages that had apparently been a recurring feature of Iron Ridge winters since longer than anyone wanted to admit. None of these things were spectacular. None of them were the kind of thing that got talked about the way a dramatic rescue or a crisis averted gets talked about. They were small, practical, unglamorous improvements that accumulated into a winter that was simply easier than the winters before it. And when Carson tried to explain this to himself, he kept running into the discomforting realization that the right word for what Eleanor had done was management. She had managed the ranch into a better position, and she'd done it so incrementally that nobody had noticed it happening, which was either very good management or very good something else. He tried to say some version of this to her in December, on an evening when the snow was coming down outside and they were both at the kitchen table, her with the ledger, him with a letter he was composing to the bank in Helena. He was aware that they had developed, in the 3 months since her arrival, a kind of domestic routine that had happened without either of them planning it. Evening at the table. Coffee from May. Separate work conducted in shared space. He wasn't sure when this had stopped feeling strange, but it had. The winter stores, he said. She looked up. What about them? You reorganized them in October. Yes. I didn't notice until now how much the difference it made. Running the numbers this week, we're down about 15% on waste compared to last December. She looked at him with the careful attention she gave things she was deciding how to respond to. We had good stock, she said. That's part of it. That's not all of it. No, she agreed. It's not all of it. He put his pen down. I want to ask you something. All right. Why haven't you said anything about it? To me, to Hank, you could have made a case, shown me the projections in advance, asked for credit when it worked. A small silence. Outside, the snow was very quiet. Because I didn't know if it would work until it did, she said. And because if I'd announced a plan and then the winter had been harder than expected and the savings hadn't materialized, I'd have spent the spring explaining why I'd been wrong instead of fixing the next problem. She looked down at the ledger. I found that the best way to earn the right to be heard is to be right about a few things first and not make a large display of the attempts in between. Carson sat with that for a moment. Your father teach you that? The question landed differently than he'd intended. He saw it in the slight change in her expression, not pain exactly, but something adjacent to it, something she filed quickly and efficiently away behind a neutral face. My father taught me a great deal, she said carefully. Most of it was about how businesses work. Some of it was about how men decide who deserves to be listened to and who doesn't, and how to navigate the distance between where you're placed and where you're useful. A pause. He didn't intend to teach me the second part. It was more of an observation. Carson thought of the letter still in his coat pocket. She is not a frontier woman. He'd been intending for 2 months to tell her about it, and each time had found a reason not to. He wrote to me, Carson said. Eleanor was very still. Your father, in October, after you arrived. A letter. He reached into his coat and put it on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately. He watched her make the decision to do so. The slight straightening of her posture, the breath she took before she reached for it, the way you brace before something you've been half expecting. She read it. He watched her face, which gave him very little. The practiced composure of someone who had learned early to manage what showed. When she put it down, she was quiet for a long moment. "He means well," she said. The words were careful, which meant they were not the whole of what she was thinking. He wrote it like he was describing someone he knows. "He knows who he raised me to be," she said. "That's different from knowing who I am." She smoothed the letter flat on the table, as though its edges had become unruly, and then she pushed it back toward him. "Keep it." "You don't want it?" "I know what it says. I don't need to own it." The fire was low, and the snow outside had deepened into something that would need to be dealt with in the morning, and Eleanor went back to her ledger with the finality of someone closing a subject. But Carson noticed that the hand she held her pencil with was not quite steady for a few minutes after, and he found himself wanting to say something about that, and not knowing what. And so he said nothing, and went back to his letter to the bank, and the evening continued around them both, quiet and working and complicated in the way that shared spaces become complicated when two people who didn't choose each other have become, without entirely meaning to, necessary to each other's daily life. He didn't sleep well that night, not because of the snow or the cattle or the ongoing Dawson situation or the bank correspondence. He lay awake thinking about Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Hale, who had come 2,000 miles to a place she'd never seen, who had been described by her own father as constitutionally incapable of frontier life, and who had in 3 months become arguably the most indispensable person on the ranch, and who had never once asked to be acknowledged for it. He thought about that letter, about a man who thought he was being protective and was actually being something else, something harder to name because it came wrapped in the language of care. A man who had taught his daughter how a business works because he loved talking about business, without understanding that he'd handed her a capability that would take her somewhere he couldn't follow and couldn't quite approve of. Carson was not a man who spent much time in the territory of other people's inner lives. It wasn't his nature. He was better with fences and cattle and ledger columns than with the subtler structures of what people carried around inside them. But he thought, lying in the dark with the snow coming down outside, that Eleanor Whitmore had probably spent a long time being capable in a world that had already decided what she was capable of, and that coming west, being shipped west, forced west, whatever the honest word for it was, might be the first time in her life that the limits other people had decided for her were simply not available. It was not a complete thought. He wasn't sure he'd gotten it right. But it stayed with him into the morning, when he came downstairs and found her already up, already at the table, already working, with the same focused steadiness she brought to every morning of every day on this cold and difficult ranch that she had arrived on as a stranger and was making, with the same patient accumulation of small efforts, into something that was unmistakably, increasingly, her own. The Dawson problem finally broke open in February. Carson had known it was coming. 4 years of legal maneuvering and shared boundary disputes had the particular quality of pressure building in a sealed space. Not a question of whether, but when. The cattle incident in October had given Thomas Pratt, the Dawsons' Helena lawyer, exactly the kind of documented grievance he'd been waiting for. And in the second week of February, a formal legal notice arrived at Iron Ridge claiming damages, disputing the fence line placement, and, this was the part that made Carson's stomach drop when he read it, asserting a historical claim to water access rights on the Southern Creek that, if it held, would cut Iron Ridge's usable water by nearly a third. He read the notice at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Eleanor across from him, and when he finished, he set it down and did not say anything for a moment because the things he wanted to say were not the kind of thing you said at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. "How bad?" Eleanor asked. She'd read it already. She was faster with documents than he was. "If Pratt makes the water claim stick, we lose access to the creek from April through August. That's our peak season. We'd have to pull the south herd entirely. The south herd is 400 head. She was quiet. Outside, the February wind was doing what February wind in Montana does, which is remind you that March is not guaranteed. What does the original land deed say about the creek? Shared access. Always has been. Shared access and exclusive access are different things. Pratt is arguing exclusive? He's arguing historical precedent, that the Dawson family used the creek exclusively before my father's deed was registered, and that the shared language was added incorrectly. Do you have the original registration? In Helena, with the Territorial Land Office. Have you seen it recently? He hadn't. He realized sitting there that he had never personally read the original registration document. He'd read summaries of it, descriptions of it, references to it in his father's papers, but the actual document was in a filing cabinet in a government office 200 miles away. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need the document first," she said. "You can't brief a lawyer on something you haven't read yourself." He took the train to Helena the following week. Eleanor came with him. This had become, without formal discussion, the way certain things worked between them. Some things Carson handled alone. Some things benefited from her presence, which processed information differently than he did and caught things he missed. They had not talked about this arrangement explicitly, which was fine because it didn't need talking about. It had simply emerged from 3 months of working alongside each other until they understood, in a practical way, what each of them was better at. On the train, she read through every document they'd brought from the ranch files. He watched her make notes in the small notebook she always carried, her handwriting quick and economical, pausing occasionally to flip back 2 or 3 pages and cross-reference something. He asked her once what she was looking at, and she said, "The dates?" And when he asked, "What about the dates?" she said, "Later," which was her way of telling him she wasn't sure yet. The Helena Land Office was a 2-story brick building that smelled of old paper and institutional authority. The clerk who retrieved the original Iron Ridge deed was a small man with excellent posture who clearly believed that the documents in his care were of greater importance than the people who came to see them, and he was not entirely wrong. He set the original registration on a reading table and stood nearby in a manner that communicated he would be watching. Eleanor read it first. Carson read it after. Then they sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a room where something has just shifted. The Creek access language in the original document was not what the Dawson family's filings had described. It was not, as Pratt had argued, a subsequent edition. It was in the original hand on the original paper, dated 1861, witnessed by 2 territorial officials whose names were also in the land office records. The shared access language was primary, not amended. Pratt knew this, Eleanor said, quietly enough that only Carson could hear. He had to have. Which means he was betting you hadn't read it. She looked at him, not accusatorially, just stating the geography of the situation, or that it wouldn't matter because the legal costs would make fighting it not worth it. She nodded slowly. That's probably the actual strategy. Not to win, to make winning too expensive. This was a thought Carson had had before about the Dawson situation, in a general way, but hearing it said plainly, stripped of the vague optimism he'd been applying to it for 4 years, had a clarifying effect. They weren't dealing with a legitimate grievance. They were dealing with a calculated financial pressure campaign designed to exhaust him into concession. "We need a lawyer," he said again. "Not just for this, for all of it." "There's a woman in Helena," Eleanor said. "Her name is Margaret Foss. She handles land disputes. She has a good record." Carson looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I wrote 3 letters in November. To the Helena Territorial Court, to the Land Office, and to the Montana Stock Growers Association. I asked who had the best record in boundary and water disputes in the last 5 years. She held his gaze steadily. Margaret Foss came up in all 3 responses. He sat with that for a moment. She'd been doing this since November. Without telling him, without being asked, she'd started quietly gathering the information they would need when the Dawson situation broke open, because she'd understood, before he'd fully admitted it to himself, that it was going to break open. "You could have told me," he said. His voice came out with a slight edge he hadn't fully intended. "I could have," she said, "and you might have said it was premature or unnecessary, and we would have had an argument about it, and nothing productive would have come from the argument. You don't know that. I know that you don't like being directed to conclusions." She said it without any particular heat. "You prefer to arrive at them yourself, which is actually a reasonable way to operate. So I gathered the information and waited for the situation to arrive." The February light through the land office windows was thin and flat. The clerk had moved to a desk across the room and was pretending to work on something else. "Margaret Foss," Carson said. "Her office is 4 blocks from here." They met with Margaret Foss that afternoon. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured, with the economical manner of someone who billed by the hour and meant it. She read the original deed, read the Dawson filing, and made 2 pages of notes without looking up. When she was finished, she said, "Pratt is fishing," and explained in precise and efficient language exactly how they were going to respond and why the water claim was not only beatable, but potentially reversible in a way that would settle the entire boundary dispute permanently. It would cost money, not as much as losing the water access, but enough. Carson authorized it on the spot, which made Margaret Foss look at him with the brief professional approval of someone who doesn't have to do the usual persuasion. On the train back to Iron Ridge, Carson was quiet for most of the first hour. Eleanor was writing in her notebook. The landscape outside the window was white and flat and enormous, the kind of view that makes thoughts feel both smaller and more important simultaneously. "I want to talk about something else," he said. She looked up. "The ranch." "Not the legal situation, the operation." He turned slightly to face her. "I've been thinking since November about what you said in October, about the efficiency of the layout." She'd said several things about the efficiency of the layout in October. Her expression told him she wasn't sure which one he meant. "The breeding program," he said. "You said we were rotating bulls conservatively. You're averaging 14 months between rotations on the premium stock. Most of the operations I've read about in the territory are doing 10 to 11 months on comparable herds. I've always run conservative because I didn't want to stress the animals." "I understand, but conservative rotation on premium stock isn't just about animal welfare. It's also about your competitive position. You're selling at market rate right now because your herd quality is good. It could be better. If we compress the rotation, and also, this is the part I've been thinking about more. If we identify the top 15% of your breeding stock and run a separate, more intensive program for those animals, not the whole herd, just the premium tier." She paused. "The calves from that tier would come in significantly above your current average weight and quality grade. You'd be selling a different product to the buyers in Great Falls." Carson looked at her. "A different product." "Buyers are starting to differentiate. The eastern markets are willing to pay premium for consistently graded cattle. Right now, you're selling quality into a market that prices everything roughly the same. That gap is going to widen over the next few years." "You've been reading about the eastern markets." "I've been reading about everything," she said without apology. "I can't understand what we're doing if I don't understand where it goes." He looked out the window for a moment. The train moved through a cut in the hills where snow had drifted against both walls, and the light came down cold and white. "It would mean capital," he said. "The premium breeding program, dedicated pasture, separate feed strategy, more hands, maybe." "Yes. The ranch is not in a position right now where we have a lot of spare capital." "I know." She was looking at him with the careful attention she gave to things she thought he might resist. "I'm not suggesting we do it immediately. I'm suggesting we plan for it. The Dawson settlement, if Margaret Foss does what she says she can do, will reduce our legal costs substantially over the next 2 years. The savings from the feed reorganization and the supplier renegotiations are accumulating. If we're disciplined about where those savings go for the next 18 months, we'd have enough to start. Not to do it fully. To start. To fence the premium pasture and designate the tier and begin the rotation compression. The returns wouldn't come immediately. First improved calving season would be 18 months out. And if there's a drought, then we manage through it," she said simply. "The same way ranchers have always managed through drought. Carefully." It wasn't a complete answer. She knew it and he knew it. But it was an honest one, which was what he'd come to expect from her. And honesty about the risks was different from denying that the risks existed. They arrived back at Iron Ridge in the early evening to find that Hank had a problem waiting. 2 breeding animals had come down sick, the early signs of something respiratory that needed Doc Heelan out first thing in the morning. Carson dealt with it, which involved riding out to look at the animals in the cold dark, and then writing an urgent message to Heelan, and then standing in the barn for a while thinking about what a respiratory illness in the breeding herd would cost in timing and money if it spread. Eleanor came out to the barn while he was standing there. She changed out of her traveling clothes and had the heavy coat on. His mother's coat, which had become simply her coat now, the way things become owned through use. "How bad?" she asked. The same 2 words she'd used that morning about the Dawson notice. "Too early to say. Heelan will know more." She stood beside him looking at the 2 animals in the corner stall. Her breath made small clouds in the cold. "I've been reading about respiratory illness in cattle. In November, when the first cases came up in the territory reports." He looked at her sideways. "And? There are 3 things that matter for containment. isolation speed, ventilation of the sick animals, and identifying which herd members had contact in the last 48 hours. She glanced at him. Do you know who they've been near? Not exactly. Hank might. Hank did. They spent an hour that evening going through the movement records Hank kept. Imperfect, not designed for disease tracking, but detailed enough to build a rough picture of which animals had been in proximity to the 2 sick ones over the past 2 days. By 9 o'clock, they had a list of 14 additional animals to watch, isolated in a separate section of the barn, with a ventilation modification that Hank and Pete Garza rigged together from materials already on hand. Doc Heelan arrived in the morning, examined the sick animals, and confirmed the isolation strategy was correct. 3 of the 14 watched animals showed early symptoms. The other 11, watched for 5 more days, stayed clean. 2 animals lost. Not 14. Not the breeding herd. Heelan said, rolling up his sleeve in the barn doorway after his examination, that the isolation response had been faster than anything he'd seen from Iron Ridge in his 20 years working the ranch. That was Mrs. Hale, Hank said, with the tone of a man making a factual statement. Heelan looked at Carson. Carson said nothing in particular. Well, Heelan said, the losses still hurt. 2 quality breeding animals was not nothing, and Carson felt it with the particular weight that serious ranchers carry about the animals in their care. Not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it. Responsibility. The sense that a loss was in some proportion a failure of attention. But sitting at the kitchen table that night, going through the numbers with Eleanor on what the isolation had prevented versus what they'd lost, he found something that made the hurt settle differently. The math was clear. Fast, correct response had contained a problem that could have cost 12 times as much. And the fast, correct response had come from a woman who had spent a November evening reading territorial livestock disease reports because she believed in understanding the territory she was operating in. He told her this, not elegantly, over coffee that had gone cold while they worked. She accepted it the same way she accepted most direct acknowledgement, with a slight tightening around the eyes that might have been anything, and a simple nod, and a return to the subject at hand. But later, when she'd gone up to sleep and he was banking the fire, he found that she'd left something on the kitchen table beside the closed ledger. A single sheet of paper, folded once, with his name on the front. He opened it. Inside was the outline she'd been developing since October. The premium breeding tier plan, the rotation compression schedule, the capital projection over 18 months, the projected return on the first improved calving season. It was thorough and precise and honest about the risks, with a line at the bottom that said, in her quick, economical hand, "This is what I think we should do, but it's your ranch and your call." He sat down with the paper for a long time. Your ranch and your call. He thought about whether that was still accurate, whether it had been fully since October, whether the ranch that existed now, slightly more efficient, slightly less wasteful, with a legal strategy and a supplier renegotiation and a disease containment protocol and a winter that had run better than any winter Carson could clearly remember, was the same ranch it had been before a woman stepped off a train and spotted a sinking fence post from a moving buckboard. He folded the paper carefully and held it. Outside, the February wind had dropped, which sometimes meant it was gathering for something worse and sometimes just meant it was done. Carson had learned over 45 years of Montana that you couldn't always tell the difference in the moment. Sometimes you just had to wait and see what came next. He put the paper in his shirt pocket, close to where the letter from Reginald Whitmore had lived for months, and went to bed thinking about capital and breeding tiers and the particular way Eleanor had said carefully when he'd asked what happened if there was a drought. Not fine. Not we'll figure it out, just carefully. He was beginning to understand that carefully was her word for everything she intended to do, which was, it turned out, nearly everything. Margaret Foss settled the Dawson dispute in April. It didn't happen the way Carson had imagined legal victories happened. There was no courtroom, no dramatic confrontation, no moment of public vindication. It happened in a letter, delivered on a Thursday morning, informing Iron Ridge Ranch that Thomas Pratt had withdrawn the water rights claim and that the boundary fence line was confirmed per the 1861 registration, with the Dawson family responsible for a portion of legal costs. Margaret Foss had apparently done something procedurally with the original deed documentation that made Pratt's position untenable enough that continuing it became more expensive than conceding. Carson read the letter twice. Then he put it on the kitchen table and went outside and stood in the April morning for a while, breathing air that had finally, genuinely started to warm. 4 years. 4 years of that particular low-grade dread that comes with an unresolved legal threat, the way it colors everything, the way it sits in the back of every financial decision like a dark variable you can't calculate around. And now it was done. Not dramatically, just done. Eleanor found him standing there when she came out for her morning ride. "The Dawson letter," he said, before she could ask. She read it standing beside him in the yard, still holding her riding gloves. When she finished, she handed it back without comment. But he saw, in the set of her shoulders, a kind of quiet release. The same thing he'd felt, but in her own key. "Margaret Foss earned her fee," he said. "She did." Eleanor pulled her gloves on. "I'm going to ride the south boundary this morning. I want to see that fence line now that it's confirmed." "That's—" He stopped. She looked at him. "What?" "That's exactly what I was going to do." A small pause. Something moved across her face that was too brief and too complicated to name. "Then come with me," she said. They rode the south boundary together in the April morning, and it was the first time since her arrival that they had ridden together without a specific operational purpose, without a problem to assess or a crisis to manage or a supply issue to inspect. Just two people on horseback going along a fence line that was, finally and legally, theirs. They didn't talk much. Carson had noticed over the winter that Eleanor was someone who could be quiet without making it uncomfortable, which was rarer than people recognized. She didn't fill silence with noise. She inhabited it, which meant that when she did speak, it carried a different weight than casual conversation. At the southern creek, the water they'd almost lost, she stopped her horse and looked at it for a moment. The spring runoff had the creek running fast and clear, and the morning light on it was the particular gold that doesn't last past 8 o'clock. "It's a good piece of water," she said. "Best on the property." "I know." She turned her horse back toward the ranch. "We need to protect it better. The fence on the east side of the access point is still original construction. It won't hold another 10 years. He almost laughed. He didn't quite, but it was close. 4 years of legal battle over this creek, resolved yesterday, and she was already at the next problem. "I'll put it on the list," he said. "It's already on the list," she said. "I put it there in January." They rode back. The premium breeding tier program started in May, which was 6 months later than Eleanor's original projection, and 2 months earlier than Carson had thought they'd be ready. The discrepancy was entirely the result of the savings from the Dawson settlement costs. With Pratt's legal campaign gone, a line item that had been draining money for 4 years suddenly became capital. They fenced the southeast pasture for the premium tier. Hank selected the animals, 22 breeding pairs from the top of the herd quality spectrum, chosen over 3 weeks of careful evaluation that Hank approached with the seriousness of someone who understood he was being trusted with something important. Eleanor had developed the selection criteria, working from the breeding records, and from 2 veterinary techs she'd ordered from a bookseller in Chicago in February. She and Hank had argued about 2 of the selections. Not badly, but specifically, the way people argue when they both know enough to disagree productively. "Bull number 7, Hank said, on the 3rd week of selection. "You've got him out. His conception rate in year 4 was below threshold. Year 4 was a drought year. Every bull in the territory had a low year 4. Eleanor looked at the record. His year 2 and year 3 were also below the average for the herd. He throws big calves, consistently. Weight-wise, he's in the top 5 animals on the property. Conception rate determines how many calves you get. Weight determines what each one sells for. You need both." Hank was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone running calculations. "What if we run him in the premium tier but monitor monthly instead of quarterly? If his rate comes up in the new environment, he stays. If it doesn't, we pull him at month 4, Eleanor said. Month 5. Month 4. If we're going to commit the premium pasture resources, we need to know before the season turns." Hank looked at Carson. Carson, who had been listening to this exchange with the particular attention he gave to things he wanted to understand and wasn't entirely following, said, "Month 4. Hank accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had learned when a decision was final. Bull number 7 went into the premium tier on a conditional basis. He turned out to be one of the best animals in the program. His conception rate in the southeast pasture, with better grass and the rotation compression Eleanor had designed, came in above average in month 3. Hank told Eleanor this with the kind of tone that managed to be simultaneously an acknowledgement that she'd been right to be uncertain and a vindication that his instinct had been worth fighting for. Eleanor accepted it with a nod and updated the records and moved to the next item. By June, the routine of the ranch had settled into something that Carson recognized as genuinely different from what it had been before October. Not just more efficient, different in character. There was more conversation in the operation, which was unexpected. Eleanor had a habit of explaining her reasoning when she made operational changes, not because she felt she needed to justify herself, but because she'd found that people who understood why they were doing something did it better. This had gradually altered the culture of the morning briefings, which had previously been Carson, or Hank, delivering instructions, and the hands receiving them. Now there were questions, sometimes pushback. Billy Crane, the youngest hand, had started offering observations about the North Pasture grass quality in a way that would have been unthinkable a year ago, and twice his observations had been correct and useful. Pete Garza, improbably, had become something close to an ally. This transformation had happened so gradually that Carson couldn't identify the exact moment it tipped. Pete was not a reformed character in any dramatic sense. He still had a temper, still occasionally said things that required a conversation afterward, still operated on an underlying philosophy that the world had too many opinions from too many people who should stay quiet. But somewhere in the winter, his specific hostility toward Eleanor had converted into a grudging respect that expressed itself in a particular Pete Garza way, which was by doing whatever she asked without commentary, and occasionally, when he thought no one senior was watching, offering to do it before she asked. Carson had watched this without remark for months. He mentioned it to Eleanor once, obliquely, and she'd said, Pete Garza needed to feel useful. He was afraid of being made irrelevant. She said it without triumph, which was probably why she'd been able to achieve it. Summer came in hard and dry, which was Montana's way of reminding you that good springs were not promises. By July, the grass in the standard pastures was thinner than Carson liked, and the water levels in the secondary troughs were dropping faster than the schedule called for. He spent 3 weeks adjusting grazing rotations and worrying about the weather in the private, constant way that ranchers worry about weather. Not frantically, but always. A background calculation running on every piece of sky and every dry morning. Eleanor worried differently. She was more visible about it, which he found strange at first and then realized was simply more honest. She'd come in from her morning rides with specific reports on pasture conditions measured against the notes she'd been keeping since October. And she'd sit with Carson in the evening and go through the numbers plainly and say, if it doesn't rain by the end of August, we need to make 3 decisions. And then she'd name the 3 decisions with the directness of someone who believed that looking at a problem clearly was better than looking away from it. The rain came in mid-August. Not generous, but enough to ease the grass pressure and refill the secondary troughs, and allow Carson to sleep 3 consecutive nights without waking up running calculations about feed costs versus market timing. The morning after this first real rain, he found Eleanor standing on the porch in the early light, watching the water come off the roof and land in the yard in small pocks. She had coffee. She didn't say anything when he came to stand beside her, which was the kind of silence that contains more than words would. "We're going to be all right," he said. It came out more plainly than he'd intended. She looked at him sideways. "We were going to be all right before the rain." "I know." "You didn't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "Not great." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should have said something. We could have gone through the contingency numbers again. It doesn't fix the rain, but it fixes the not knowing." "I didn't want to." He stopped. "Worry me?" The words sat there between them in the rain smell of the morning. "That's a habit you should probably lose," she said, not unkindly. "We're in this together. The worrying is part of together." He didn't say anything, but he heard it, and it settled somewhere specific. The first premium tier calving season happened in early spring of the following year, and it was the moment when everything Eleanor had projected either proved itself or didn't. It proved itself. Not cleanly, not without loss. 3 calves didn't make it through the first week, which cost them, and which Hank carried heavily for days afterward. But the numbers that came out of the southeast pasture in those 6 weeks were different from anything Iron Ridge had produced before. The average birth weight was up. The health outcomes were measurably better. And when Carson took the first-tier calves to the Great Falls buyers in June, he came back with a price per head that made him sit in the buckboard on the way home, doing arithmetic with his fingers because he wanted to be sure he hadn't misheard. He hadn't misheard. He told Eleanor the number that evening. She wrote it in the ledger without visible reaction for about 4 seconds. And then she put the pencil down and pressed both hands flat on the table and exhaled, which was the most unguarded thing he'd seen from her in a year and a half of living in the same house. "That's enough," she said, meaning it was enough to fund the second phase of the program, and to begin work on the east fence, and to make the payment to the Helena Bank ahead of schedule. "That's more than enough," he said. She looked at him. There was something in her face that she didn't immediately manage, a rawness, quickly recovered, that Carson thought might be the surface of something much larger. The weight of having been right about something she'd staked a great deal on, in a place where being wrong would have cost more than money. "It worked," she said, and the two words were very simple and very insufficient for what they were carrying. "It worked," he agreed. May produced something resembling a celebration dinner that evening, which for May meant a better cut of meat and a pie that hadn't been on the schedule. She set it on the table without comment and went back to the kitchen, which was how May celebrated things. Hank came in from the bunkhouse because Carson had told him the numbers, and Hank had come to the door with his hat in his hands, and Carson had told him to sit down and eat, which Hank did, and the four of them, Carson, Eleanor, Hank, May, at the kitchen door with a coffee cup, occupied the same space in the particular warmth that follows a thing going right after a long period of not being sure it would. "Old Henry's great-grandson is in that tier," Hank said at some point, meaning the breeding bulls. "I know," Eleanor said. "I put him in there." "You did?" Hank nodded slowly, with the satisfaction of a man who has been part of something and knows it. "Seems right." The reputation came the way these things come, not announced, not dramatic, but through the ordinary accumulation of results that get talked about. The Great Falls buyers talked to other buyers, the buyers talked to ranchers. The ranchers started asking questions. By the second premium calving season, Carson had received 4 separate requests from neighboring operations asking about his breeding program, and 2 of those requests came with implicit offers of money for information. He didn't know, initially, how to respond to this. He'd spent 15 years building something he considered private, his operation, his methods, his particular solutions to the specific problems of Iron Ridge land and Iron Ridge cattle. The idea of opening that to competitors sat uneasily with him. Eleanor saw it differently. "They're not all competitors," she said, one evening when he'd told her about the 3rd request, from a rancher named Foster who ran a medium-sized operation 2 counties east. "Some of them are just trying to survive. The difference between a rancher who figures this out and one who doesn't isn't market competition. The market is big enough. The difference is the rancher losing his land versus keeping it. That's his problem to solve." "It doesn't have to be." She looked at him directly. "You had 15 years to figure this out, and you're still good at it, but it cost you things you didn't need to spend. What if someone had handed you what you needed in year 3 instead of year 15? He didn't have a clean answer to that. The first person they helped was not Foster. It was a young rancher named Caleb Mercer, 26 years old, who showed up at Iron Ridge on a September morning without an appointment and asked to speak to whoever was in charge with the manner of someone who has used up most of his pride getting to the door. Hank brought him to the yard and Carson came out, and Mercer stood there with his hat in both hands and explained his situation in the flat, stripped-down way men talk about things that are humiliating to talk about. His family's ranch, 3 generations, 160 acres east of Mill Haven, was failing. Not dramatically, not because of a single catastrophe, but in the slow accumulation of small wrong decisions and bad luck, and the particular cruelty of a financial structure that punishes a hard year and rewards nothing except consistent success. He had debt he couldn't service, a herd that wasn't performing, and a father in poor health who didn't need to watch the ranch his grandfather built go under. Carson listened to all of this and then said, "Come inside." Eleanor was at the kitchen table. Mercer looked at her with a slight uncertainty that Carson recognized. The brief recalibration of a young man who had expected this to be a conversation between ranchers and found it was something else. "This is my wife," Carson said. "Eleanor runs the operations side of this ranch. If you want help, she's who you need to talk to." Mercer looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Mercer with the direct assessing attention she gave everything new. Tell me about your breeding stock, she said. Not how many, what you have, Mercer told her. She asked questions for 40 minutes, and her questions were so specific and so sequential that by the end of them, Mercer had a clearer picture of his own operations problems than he'd had walking in the door. Carson watched this and said almost nothing because Eleanor was doing something he'd seen her do before. She was leading someone to see their own situation clearly, which was harder than seeing it for them and more useful. Your core problem, Eleanor said finally, isn't the debt. The debt is the symptom. Your core problem is that your herd quality has been declining for 3 breeding cycles, and you haven't been able to address it because you don't have the capital. And you don't have the capital partly because the declining herd quality is reducing your returns. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I know that, he said. I just don't know how to break out of it. You need to restructure the breeding program before you do anything else about the debt. If you restructure the debt first, you'll have lower payments but the same declining return, and you'll be back in the same position in 3 years. The bank won't wait for me to fix the breeding program. Which bank? First Territorial in Billings. Eleanor looked at Carson. Carson said, I know the manager at First Territorial. His name is Walter Hess. He's not unreasonable. Would you... Mercer stopped. Started again. Would you be willing to write something on my behalf? Something I could take to Hess? Carson considered this. A letter of support from Iron Ridge Ranch, which had in the past 2 years acquired a reputation that he was still getting used to, would carry weight with Walter Hess. It would also associate Iron Ridge with Mercer's situation, which was a risk if Mercer's ranch ultimately failed anyway. He looked at Eleanor. I'll do more than write a letter, she said to Mercer. I'll put together a restructuring plan for the breeding program that you can show Hess alongside the letter, something specific enough that he can evaluate whether it's viable. She paused. But I need you to be honest with me about your numbers. All of them. Not the version that makes the situation look better than it is. Mercer looked like someone who had been handed something unexpectedly heavy. Why would you do that? He said. I've got nothing to offer you. I know, she said. That's not the point. He came back the following week with his records, and Eleanor spent 3 days going through them. She did it at the kitchen table, the same way she'd gone through Iron Ridge's books on her first evening, with the same focused, methodical attention, and Carson would come in occasionally and find her there, surrounded by Mercer's ledgers, writing in her own notebook with the particular concentration that meant she was working through something. On the 4th day, she had a plan. It was 40 pages, handwritten, covering the breeding restructure, a phased debt repayment schedule, operational changes to reduce costs in the first 18 months, and a projected recovery timeline over 3 years. Carson read it before she gave it to Mercer, and he found 2 things in it he would have done differently, which he told her, and she changed one of them and explained why she was keeping the other. And her reasoning was sound. Mercer came to collect it on a Friday. He sat at the kitchen table and read through it with the slow, careful attention of someone who doesn't want to miss anything. And when he finished, he put it down and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Come back in 3 years and tell me how it went, Eleanor said. That's how you thank me. He went to First Territorial with the plan in Carson's letter. Walter Hess restructured the debt. Mercer went home and began the breeding program changes. Carson heard, through the particular informal network that connected Montana ranchers across distances that made formal communication impractical, that Mercer's first reorganized calving season went better than expected. He told Eleanor this on an evening in November, exactly 2 years after her arrival at Iron Ridge, though neither of them remarked on the date. She nodded, and there was something in her face that was quieter than satisfaction. Not pride exactly, something more like the feeling of a thing being what it should be. He'll have a hard year still, she said. Probably 2. The recovery isn't linear. No, Carson agreed. It never is. The fire was going, and outside the November wind was the same as it had always been, indifferent and enormous, moving across the Montana dark. May had gone to bed. Hank was in the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet in the particular way it got quiet at this hour, settled into itself, breathing. Carson looked at the woman across the table from him. This woman who had arrived on a train 14 months ago with one bag and a fearless stare, who had been sent west as a transaction and had turned herself into a force of nature so gradually and so practically that the territory around her was still catching up to the fact. Eleanor, he said, She looked up from the ledger. There were things he'd been meaning to say for months. Things that had accumulated through a Montana winter, and a legal battle, and a breeding program, and a drought scare, and a young rancher's crisis, and all the ordinary days between those things. The mornings at the kitchen table, the evening rides, the arguments about bull rotation that were somehow never really just about bull rotation. He'd been collecting the words for all of it for a long time, and now they were available, and he found he didn't entirely trust them. "You changed this place," he said. It wasn't the full version of what he meant, but it was true, and it was what he could deliver without overclaiming. She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't entirely read her expression, which was still, after 14 months, something that happened more than he'd like. "We changed it," she said. He started to say something about the distinction, about how much of it was her specifically, the things only she had seen and done. And she said, before he could, "Don't argue with me about this, Carson." He closed his mouth. "I needed this place as much as it needed me," she said. "Maybe more. I needed somewhere that would let me be what I actually am instead of what I was supposed to be." Her voice was level, but something behind it wasn't quite. "That's not nothing. You gave me that, whether you meant to or not." The fire shifted. Outside, the wind ran along the roof the way it always did. He thought about a cream-colored envelope. She is not a frontier woman. He thought about the train platform in October, a year and a month ago, and a woman stepping down with one bag and looking at his fence post before she looked at him. He thought about old Henry's rotation record and Tom Barker's face when he said 9 cents, and the drainage problem in the southeast corner and the premium calving numbers that had made him do arithmetic on his fingers in the buckboard because he couldn't quite believe them. "I know," he said. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she looked back down at the ledger, and the evening continued and the fire burned, and Iron Ridge Ranch sat in the Montana dark being what it had become, which was something neither of them had been able to predict on the day she arrived, and something better than either of them had been able to manage alone. Caleb Mercer came back in 3 years, as Eleanor had asked him to. He came on a Thursday in September, driving his own buckboard now instead of borrowing his neighbor's, and he looked different in a way that Carson noticed immediately. Not just older, but settled. The desperate thinness around his eyes that he'd had the first time he stood in the Iron Ridge yard was gone. A man looked different when he wasn't carrying the specific weight of impending failure. Carson had seen it enough times to recognize the absence of it. Eleanor was in the southeast pasture when Mercer arrived, doing what she still did every morning, even now. Riding the land, looking at it, finding the things that needed attention before they became things that needed fixing. Carson sent Billy to get her and took Mercer inside, and May produced coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by who showed up at this kitchen table. When Eleanor came in, Mercer stood up, which was a thing she'd told Carson once she never expected and always noticed. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "the ranch is on its feet." She sat down across from him. "Tell me the numbers," he told her. Carson listened, doing the arithmetic in his head, and what he heard was a turnaround that wasn't spectacular. It wasn't the premium tier results, wasn't a doubling and redoubling of profit, but it was real. Mercer's herd quality had come up. His debt service was current for the first time in 4 years. The third breeding cycle under the restructured program had produced calves that went to market above his county's average for the first time his ranch had managed that in a decade. His father was still alive. That was the thing Mercer said at the end, quietly, without framing it as particularly significant, which meant it was the most significant thing. "My father got to see it come back," he said. That mattered." Eleanor looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "You did the work," she said. "We handed you a map. You still had to walk the ground." "I know," Mercer said, "but you handed me the map when I didn't have one. That's not a small thing." He left after an hour, and he left with something else Eleanor had put together for him over the previous week, a second document, this one focused on the next phase of his operation, suggestions for where to take the program now that the recovery was complete, and he had room to think forward instead of just backward. She hadn't told Carson she was preparing it. He'd found it on the table the previous morning, 40 pages again, the same careful hand. He hadn't said anything about it at the time, but after Mercer's buckboard cleared the gate, he stood in the yard for a moment and said, "You started on that document before he arrived." 2 weeks ago," she said. You were that certain he'd have good news. She considered this. I was certain he'd done the work. Whether the work had been enough was going to depend on weather and market and things neither of us controls. She paused. I decided to prepare either way. If the news was bad, the document would have been different. He thought about that. The version of Eleanor who had been prepared for bad news too, who had a different 40 pages sitting in her mind ready to adapt, seemed to him like the most honest possible description of how she operated. Not optimism, not pessimism, just preparation, in every direction the situation might go. It was, he had come to understand, one of the things about her that he admired most and found most quietly exhausting to be married to. Word about Mercer spread the way things spread in ranch country, which was slowly and thoroughly, person to person across distances that made it seem impossible and yet somehow wasn't. By the following spring, they had 7 requests from struggling operations, 2 from ranchers who weren't struggling but wanted to refine their breeding programs, and 1 from a banker in Billings who had read Walter Hess's notes on the Iron Ridge letter and wanted to discuss whether Eleanor might be willing to consult on assessments of agricultural loan applicants. That last one Carson was not sure about. A banker, he said when the letter arrived. His name is Aldridge, Eleanor said. Norman Aldridge. I've heard of him. He's careful. He wants to hire you to advise on loans. He wants to pay us for information that we generate anyway by looking at struggling operations. She set the letter down. It's not a conflict of interest. If anything, it's aligned. We'd be helping ranchers make cases to the bank, while helping the bank evaluate which cases are genuine. It's also time. Everything is time. She looked at him. I'm not suggesting I do it alone. I'm suggesting we think about whether it makes sense. They thought about it for 2 weeks, and then they met with Aldridge in Millhaven, rather than Helena, because Eleanor had suggested that Aldridge coming to them was the appropriate direction for this particular negotiation. And Aldridge, who Carson assessed quickly as a man sharp enough to know when he was dealing with someone sharper, had agreed without visible argument. The consulting arrangement they reached was limited, specific, and on terms that Eleanor wrote out herself before the meeting and handed to Aldridge at the beginning of it, which made Carson, sitting beside her, feel something between admiration and the faint, uncomfortable awareness that he would not have known to do that. It was a small thing, in the scope of what Iron Ridge had become, but it was also the moment that Carson recognized with the clarity that sometimes comes when you're looking back rather than forward, that the ranch had stopped being just a ranch somewhere along the way and had become something harder to name, a kind of center of gravity for the people and operations around it. Not because they'd sought that, because Eleanor had understood early that the knowledge they were accumulating had value beyond their own fence lines, and she'd been patient enough to let that value find its own shape. She was not always easy to be with across those years. Carson wanted to be honest about that, at least to himself, because the version of a marriage that gets remembered tends to sand down the rough parts until they disappear, and that felt like a disservice to what it had actually been. She was demanding in the way that people are demanding when they hold themselves to standards and can't quite understand why everyone around them doesn't operate the same way. She got frustrated. Not loudly, but in a way that was somehow worse than loud. The particular quiet of a person who has explained something twice and is deciding whether explaining it a third time is worth the effort. She was sometimes so focused on the next problem that she moved past the current one before the people working with her had finished processing it. And she was right, frequently enough to be occasionally insufferable about it, in the way that people who are often right can't always help being insufferable, even when they're trying not to be. Carson told her this once. Not that she was insufferable, he chose a different word, but that the pace of her mind was sometimes hard to keep up with, and that it created a distance between what she understood and what the people around her had gotten to yet, and that distance cost something. She'd been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd said, I know, it's something I work on. And then after another pause, I don't always manage it. I know, he said. Does it? She stopped, started again, and he could see the effort of it, which was unusual enough to make him pay attention. Does it make this harder? Being married to someone who... No, he said. You didn't let me finish. You were going to ask if it makes this harder in general. The answer is no. She looked at him with the specific expression she had when she was deciding whether to believe something. It makes it different, he said. Harder would be the wrong word. She seemed to accept this, or at least to decide to proceed on the basis of it. Hank Briggs retired in the 7th year. He'd been talking about it for 2 before he actually did it, in the way that men talk about retiring from work they love, using the future tense as a kind of practice for an idea they haven't fully committed to. When he actually handed Carson the news, formally, on a Monday morning in April, Carson was surprised anyway, which meant the practice runs hadn't really worked. Eleanor handled the transition, which meant she had also seen it coming and had been quietly thinking about it for longer than she'd said. She had a candidate in mind, a man named Robert Early, who ran the eastern operations for a ranch in Chouteau County, and who had, she mentioned, written to the Stock Growers Association asking about opportunities 18 months prior. "You've been tracking this person for 18 months, Carson said. "I read the correspondence log when I reorganized the filing system," she said. He seemed worth remembering. Robert Early came for an interview and was, within a week, the kind of obvious fit that makes you wonder how you got along without someone. He was 38, methodical, with a particular talent for the breeding side of the operation that complemented, rather than duplicated, what Eleanor was already doing. Hank spent a month walking him through the ranch before he left, and on Hank's last day, Eleanor had May make the good dinner, and Carson had told Hank in the yard, privately, that there were 11 years of this ranch in him, and that none of it was going anywhere. Hank had shaken his hand and looked somewhere past his shoulder and said, "She's something, your wife," which covered a great deal of ground in 4 words. "Yeah," Carson said, "she is." The letter from Reginald Whitmore came on a December morning in the 8th year. Not a lawyer's letter this time, a personal letter, in the same irregular, forceful handwriting as the one Carson had carried in his pocket for months in that first year, but different in character, shorter, and with the particular quality of a letter that has been rewritten several times, starting over until the writer gets to the version they can actually send. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table. Carson watched her face, which gave him some things and not others, the same as it always had. Reginald Whitmore was ill, not dying immediately, but declining in the way that serious illness declines, with enough clarity about the direction to make a person think about things they'd been not thinking about. He was writing, the letter said, because there were things he should have said before now. He was writing because he'd heard, through people who knew people, what Iron Ridge Ranch had become. He was writing because someone had shown him the article in the Montana Stock Growers Journal that had described Eleanor's consulting work and quoted her by name, and he'd read it 3 times. Jeez. The letter did not say I was wrong. Reginald Whitmore was not, apparently, a man who used those words easily, but it said something that bent in that direction without quite arriving there. It said he had not understood what he was sending her into, or what she was capable of, or what she would make of a situation he'd thought of as a financial arrangement and nothing more. It said he thought of her often. It said he hoped she was well. Eleanor put the letter down. She sat with it for a moment, looking at it, and Carson did not ask what she was thinking because some things don't benefit from being asked. Then she said, "I'm going to write back." "Okay." "I'm going to invite him to visit." Carson absorbed this. "Montana in winter is hard on spring," she said. "I'll tell him spring." Reginald Whitmore came in May. He was smaller than Carson had imagined from his handwriting, a compact man in his late 60s with the careful movements of someone whose body was giving him arguments. He arrived on the same train Eleanor had arrived on, 8.5 years earlier, and Carson drove out to meet him because Eleanor had suggested it, and Carson had agreed that the gesture mattered. The drive back to Iron Ridge was not comfortable. The 2 men had nothing specific in common except Eleanor, and Reginald Whitmore was not a man who made small talk easily, and Carson was not a man who saw the point of it. They were quiet for most of the 6 miles, with occasional observations about the landscape that served mainly to confirm that both of them were physically present in the buckboard. When the ranch came into view, the southeast pasture, the rebuilt barn, the main house with its 29 years of practical history, Carson heard Whitmore make a sound beside him. Not a word. Something quieter than a word. Eleanor was in the yard when they arrived. She'd come out of the house and was standing the same way she'd stood on a dozen mornings watching 100 small things about Iron Ridge that needed watching. And she looked at her father getting carefully down from the buckboard, and something moved across her face that Carson looked away from because it was private. He took care of the horses and gave them an hour. When he came back to the house, they were at the kitchen table. Eleanor had the ledgers out. Not the current ones, the old ones. The ones from before she arrived. She was showing him something, pointing at a column, and Reginald Whitmore was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, looking at it with an expression that Carson thought, privately, was probably the closest the man ever got to astonished. "This is what it was," she was saying, "and this is what it became. The change in the breeding program happened here." She turned pages. "And the legal settlement freed up capital for the first expansion in this year. The consulting work started here and has grown by—" "Eleanor," her father said. She looked up. He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man standing at the edge of something he'd waited too long to say and was finding it harder than he'd anticipated. "You built something," he said. "You actually built something." The sentence was insufficient. They both knew it. But it was what he had, and she received it with the same quality she gave to things that cost something, steadily, without making it easier or harder than it was. "We built it," she said, which was what she always said. Whitmore stayed for 2 weeks. He walked the property with Carson, who found over the days that they had more in common than the buckboard ride had suggested. Both were men who had made things with their hands and their decisions and their years, and that turned out to be enough common ground for conversation that surprised both of them with how easily it came. He and Eleanor talked in the evenings in ways that Carson was not privy to. He didn't ask. What he observed from the outside was that something was being negotiated between them that was older than Iron Ridge and older than the marriage contract and older than the letter about what she was constitutionally capable of. Something that had its roots in a Boston house, where a girl had listened to her father talk about business because she had no choice, and had walked away understanding more than he'd meant to give her. He left on a Friday. At the gate, he shook Carson's hand with a firmness that felt like more than a handshake, and Carson gripped back with the same intention. To Eleanor, he said something that Carson was close enough to hear but understood was not for him. He said, "Your mother would have—" And then he stopped, and Eleanor's face did the thing it rarely did, and he put one hand briefly on her shoulder and then turned and got into the buckboard that was taking him to the station. They watched him go. The Montana morning was clear and already warm, the kind of May morning that makes you forget the winter was ever as hard as it was. Carson stood beside her. He didn't say anything, because nothing needed to be said. After a moment, Eleanor turned back toward the house, toward the kitchen table and the ledgers and the morning's list of things that needed doing. But she stopped in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and looked back at the road where her father's buckboard was getting smaller. "He's proud of me," she said. She said it quietly, like something she was still deciding whether to believe. "He should be," Carson said. She looked at him over her shoulder. The expression on her face was the most unguarded he'd ever seen from her in 9 years. Not the controlled directness she presented to problems, not the careful composure she carried in difficult conversations, but something underneath all of that, something that had been waiting a long time for what her father had driven out here to give her. "Come inside," she said. "We have work." He followed her in. The years settled after that. The way years settle when the hard-won things have been won, and what remains is the work of maintaining them and passing them forward. They had 2 children, a daughter, Clara, who arrived in the 10th year with her mother's particular quality of watchfulness and her father's stubbornness in exact and inconvenient combination, and a son, James, 3 years after Clara, who showed early signs of being the kind of child who learns best by taking things apart to see how they work, which was fine as long as it wasn't anything important. Clara would take over the breeding program books before she was 12, which Eleanor allowed and Carson pretended not to notice, because acknowledging it would have led to a conversation about what a 12-year-old should be doing with her time. And that conversation was one where Eleanor's position was clearer than his. Iron Ridge grew, not recklessly, that was never Eleanor's way, but steadily, with the particular confidence of an operation that understood what it was good at and kept getting better at it. The premium tier program expanded to 3 pastures. The consulting work became a formalized arrangement with the Stock Growers Association that brought Eleanor to Helena twice a year to work with struggling ranchers in a structured setting. She was not always right. There was a year when a breeding decision she'd championed went wrong in a way that cost them real money and a full season of progress. She sat with that in the evenings for a week, going back through the logic, finding where the reasoning had been sound and where it hadn't. She didn't perform guilt about it, which would have been easier in some ways to deal with. She was simply quiet and working. And then she came to Carson on a Thursday and told him exactly what she'd gotten wrong and what she was going to do differently, with the precision of someone who has looked at a failure long enough to understand it completely. "I know," he said, meaning he'd already seen most of it. "You could have said something sooner," she said. "You were figuring it out." She looked at him. "You could have helped me figure it out faster." "Maybe," he said, "but you do your best thinking when you're left to it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's—" She stopped. "True?" "Annoying," she said, "because it's true. The thing about a life built from an arrangement neither person chose is that it doesn't look like what people imagine when they imagine love. There was no single moment of clarity, no morning when Carson woke up understanding everything that Eleanor was to him. It accumulated, the same way her improvements to the ranch had accumulated, in small recognitions and adjustments and the growing certainty that who you were had been shaped by who the other person was, and that the shaping was not something you could separate from yourself anymore even if you tried. She had changed him. He knew that. She had changed the way he looked at problems, the habit of sitting with information before acting on it, the willingness to question what had always been done because it had always been done. She had changed what he considered possible, which was maybe the most significant change a person can make in another person. He had changed her too, though she was less likely to talk about it. She had come west constitutionally incapable, according to her father, and she had become someone who rode fence lines in November and renegotiated breeding contracts and sat in land offices in Helena and looked at the original deed with the specific look of someone who has found what she was looking for. But she had also, and this was the part that was harder to quantify, she had also become someone who trusted her own conclusions in a way she hadn't when she arrived. Someone who had been given a place where what she was actually was enough, and who had learned slowly and imperfectly to believe that. That was not entirely Carson's doing, but it wasn't entirely not his doing either. In the 15th year, the same number of years it had taken Carson to build Iron Ridge before she arrived, a journalist from a newspaper in Helena came to interview Eleanor for a piece about women in Montana's agricultural economy. Carson stayed out of it, which was Eleanor's preference and his own. She sat with the journalist at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd read the account books on her first night, where she'd shown her father the ledgers, where she and Carson had argued about bull rotation and drought contingencies, and the right amount of risk to take on any given decision. The journalist asked her when she'd known that Iron Ridge was going to succeed. Eleanor thought about this for a moment. Carson, in the adjacent room, heard the pause and found himself listening for the answer. "I didn't know," she said. "You don't know going in. You just decide what you're going to do, and then you do it, and then you see." "Were you frightened?" the journalist asked. "When you first came out here?" Another pause. Longer. "I was frightened on the train," she said. "Not of the territory. Of being wrong, of having decided I could do something I couldn't actually do." Her voice was even, describing it from a distance. "But then I got here, and there was a fence post sinking in the yard, and I pointed it out, and I moved on to the next thing. And somewhere in there the fear became something else." "What did it become?" "Work," she said. "It became work." Carson sat back in his chair and looked at the wall that separated him from that kitchen table. And he thought about a train platform in October, and a woman stepping down with one bag and looking at his fences before she looked at him, and he thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this one. All the things that had been broken and fixed and built and lost and rebuilt. All the mornings and all the arguments and all the small accumulated recognitions that added up to a life. The journalist published her piece in November. The headline called Eleanor Hale the most influential woman in Montana ranching. She read it once, set it down, and said, "They spelled Heelan's name wrong in the caption." Carson didn't say anything. "And the profit figures for year 7 are off by about $40. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "It's a good piece," he said. She looked at it again. Something moved across her face, brief and human and real. "It is," she said. And then she put it away and went back to the ledger, because there was still work, and there would always be work. And that was the thing she'd come 2,000 miles and 15 years to understand was not a burden, but a gift. The endless, demanding, specific, irreplaceable work of building something that mattered and keeping it alive. Outside, the Montana sky was the particular blue it gets in November, hard and clear and enormous, the kind of sky that makes the land beneath it look like what it is. A place where the things that last are the things that were built carefully and honestly and by more than one pair of hands. Iron Ridge Ranch stood in it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.